So welcome everybody. I'm excited to be here today. Unfortunately, struggling with the technical issues a little bit, but we've got a really exciting conference and exciting presentation. I'm happy to be able to share with you all. So my name's Lewis Brown. I am an associate professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. And today I'm going to be talking about our evaluation of the Supervision of Peer Workforce project. And I will say I'm here with my son, so if he pops in at some moment unexpectedly, well, we'll just manage those distractions. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes.
So, I need to get into, okay. So to give you guys an overview of what I'll be talking about today, so the project, the Supervision of Peer Workforce project was funded by the California Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. It was developed and implemented by SHARE, the Self-Help and Recovery Exchange, who I've been working with closely on this project. And so the project sought to maximize the efficacy of both peer workers and their supervisors, thereby improving outcomes for service recipients. And the trainings were provided by nationally recognized leaders in the peer workforce. So today, I'm going to be talking about a cluster randomized trial that we did and the project outcomes from that trial. And so this will be preliminary findings because we're still working on the data. But before I get into the evaluation and the findings, I wanted to talk about the intervention itself some. So SHARE provided a series of 4 trainings. The first one on strategies for an effective peer workforce, and then the second on becoming an ally to address discrimination, followed by a trauma-informed developmental model of supervision, and finally the AntiStigma Workshop. So I'll talk about each of those trainings a little bit more. So the strategies for an effective peer workforce training really covered 5 core best practices for peer services. The first being peer listening and disclosing, and the second being recovery planning, followed by the use of self-help support groups, and peer bridging, as well as evoking the helper therapy principle, which is the idea that by helping others, you can help yourself. So some of the learning objectives they got covered were best practices for self-help group referrals, as well as understanding some of the differences between peer worker and clinician responsibilities, and some of the strategies both peer providers and supervisors can use to reduce stress and improve self-care. So the next training on becoming an ally was really focused on discrimination within agencies in the community and cultivating those allies so that you know, they can work to help others speak up for themselves and use their voice to attain personal goals. A core aspect of this was thinking about like a time when you were othering, where you were the othered person, or you know, the one that was thought of as not like others, and you know, kind of relating those experiences to stigma and cultivating a dialogue around these issues of othering, and you know, really developing skills around having these intergroup dialogues and that are much more inquiry and advocacy oriented rather than debates. Okay, then the third training on the trauma-informed developmental model of supervision That focused on trauma-informed practical tips and strategies, both for self-care and for supervision. It really approached supervision as allies working together to create better results. And both the peers and the supervisors focused on understanding how their trauma experience is connected to their own mental health and building self-awareness around that. And then finally, both the peers and the supervisors worked together to develop a joint trauma-informed developmental model of supervision for their specific work. Oh, and by the way, if there's questions along the way, if I skip something important, just feel free to interrupt. The AntiStigma Workshop was the last training, and that's an evidence-based training delivered by On Our Own of Maryland, which is a peer-run organization. That training really focused on helping people recognize how they're impeded by stigma against people with mental illness, and by kind of developing that larger critical consciousness around recognizing stigma and where it is. You start to notice the stigmatizing comments and behaviors more easily, and they're really having an opportunity to change those behaviors and reduce stigma in the workplace. So those were the 4 trainings. They were each about a day long, and that's what we're evaluating the outcomes from in this cluster randomized trial. So we collected data at baseline, then they did the trainings, and then we have 12-month follow-up data. All the data collection was done online via online surveys to both peer workers and supervisors. For the recruitment for the trial, initially we had 90 sites, and at the end of the day, 5 dropped, and we ended up with 85 sites who participated in the trial. One sort of point of clarification is that a site is a unique address. So certain provider organizations had several addresses around town where they would use to serve different areas. So there was only 54 organizations, but the randomization was done at the site level. Amongst those 85 sites, 32 were Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health operated sites, and then 51 contracted sites. And there was actually 2 sites from outside of LA that heard about the training and the trial and were interested in participating, and so we enrolled them as well. But the vast majority of the work was all done in LA County. These different sites had an average of 4 peer workers and 1.5 supervisors per site. Prior to randomization, we did matched pairs. So we would match 2 sites that were fairly similar, whether they were both Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health operated, and also looking at their size. And then one would go into the intervention group and one would go into the standard practice control group. And of course, the intervention group got the trainings, and the standard practice control group really just went on with life as usual, just doing the baseline and follow-up surveys. So to talk a little bit more about the sample, I'm only going to talk about the peer worker data today. So I mentioned we administered surveys to both the peer workers and their supervisors, and we're still working on analyzing the peer supervisor data. So we'll just talk about the peer worker data today. There were 373 peer workers at those 85 sites who were invited to complete a survey, and various reasons why people did or did not complete the survey. 8 of them didn't meet inclusion criteria. So that the inclusion criteria being that if you're a volunteer, you had to work more than 15 hours a week. So we didn't want didn't want volunteers who were, you know, loosely involved with the organization included in the study. It was really either anyone who's paid or people who were putting in a very substantial number of volunteer hours. There were 22 who just declined to participate in the study and in completing the surveys. 49 left their job before the follow-up and were excluded for that reason. 13 dropped out for unknown reasons, and 70 just never responded to the invitations to participate. So we would send emails, and then if people didn't respond via email, we'd call. And yeah, some people just never responded. But 211 peer workers did complete the baseline survey. So that's 57% from 76 sites got some participation in the study. And then we did the 12-month follow-up, and we had an 80% response rate there. So there were 169 people from 67 sites who we really have data on for analysis purposes. So among that sample of 169, there was 23% male and 75% female. The average age was 48. The median educational attainment of some college. And then, so we had a question where we asked, you know, are you a mental health consumer, a family of a consumer? And you just checked all that apply. So these are not mutually exclusive, but 59% were mental health consumers, 33% family members of consumers. And then I'm guessing the parents and caregivers, there's a lot of overlap there too. So that's a little bit about the sample. Okay, so in terms of intervention engagement, so I mentioned there's 169 people in the trial, 78 were in the comparison condition and 91 were in the intervention condition. And so we looked at the, you know, getting people to go to the, you know, it's one thing to complete the survey and then another to actually, you know, take days out of your work week and go to these trainings. So we had 57 people attend the first training on the strategies for an effective peer workforce. So that's a 63% success rate there. And then a little lower in the second, third, and fourth trainings. So most people went to at least one. A lot of people went to two. Some people went to all four. Some people didn't go to any. So, you know, sort of the treatment compliance in randomized trial lingo is limited, which is, you know, kind of to be expected in this large real world effort to randomize or to evaluate this training. Okay, so the measures we looked at, I'll try and go through these briefly. We have peer supportive organizational climate, which is, well, that was designated as a primary outcome. We did, there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov where you have to tell people what your outcomes are before you do any analyses. And they want to know what your primary outcomes are and your secondary outcomes. And we have a lot of outcomes in the study, most of which are secondary. But that's what that primary outcome means. Like, that's one of the things we really thought we really hoped to make a difference on. And so this was a 6-item scale, and it looked at the extent to which the site really is supportive of peer workers. And then the other site level outcome was recovery orientation of services. And so that one really looked at the extent to which peer workers perceived their organization, you know, promoted interactions between service users and providers that were equitable and respectful. And then we also asked the peer workers to rate the quality of supervision. Some of the sort of near-term peer worker outcomes that we looked at were their experiences of discrimination, as well as their use of peer support. So the use of peer support was the only scale that we created ourselves for this study. The others were using from various sources. And this really looked at, you know, the things like the extent to which you're involved in peer bridging and making referrals to support groups, how much time you spend on those peer support activities as opposed to, you know, things like clinical or administrative work. All right, and so we also had some more distal peer worker outcomes. So recovery is one of them that we looked at, and that was also designated as a primary outcome, and that comes from the recovery assessment scale, which is widely used. We had just one item, job satisfaction question. We had a worker burnout scale, the sick leave and disability days, so that was just self-reported sick leave and disability days in the past 6 months. We also used the brief symptom inventory, which is a popular measure of anxiety and depression and other mental health symptoms. We used a popular stress scale that looks at you know, global perceived stress, and then also social support, the extent to which you feel supported and are satisfied with that social support. Okay, so the analysis, we did everything in SAS. We used the multi-level regression models that accounted for the clustering of individuals within sites. We also used multiple imputation to estimate the missing data. And so for these different outcomes that I just talked about, that, you know, those are the dependent variables, obviously one per model. And then we would put in the baseline measure of that dependent variable. So we're really looking at change over time in the dependent variable. And we also controlled for gender, age, educational attainment, and whether someone was a mental health consumer or not. So on to the results. I'm just sharing the Cohen's D, which is a measure of effect size with, you know, something like 0.2 being a small effect size and 0.5 generally considered like a medium effect size, and then, you know, 0.8 or larger would be considered a large effect size. But this is just, it's like the difference between the treatment group and the control group on these different measures. You can also think of this as like a standard deviation change in the outcomes. So we had two significant outcomes, both of them at the site level. So the peer supportive organizational climate and the recovery orientation of services. We saw small to medium effects on both of those outcomes. So to try and put this in English, it would be, you know, people in the intervention group had a 0.35 or 0.35 standard deviations higher on the measure of peer supportive organizational climate and 0.44 standard deviations higher on the measure of recovery orientation of services. And then I also shared the 95% confidence interval, which is sort of like the range that we think this point estimate is in, and the p-value. So I bolded the two that were significant, and then we had non-significant associations between the intervention condition and supervisor quality, discrimination experience, and use of peer support. Similarly, for the distal peer work outcomes, we did not see significant differences between the treatment and control groups. So recovery, job satisfaction, work-related burnout, sick leave, and disability days brief symptom inventory, stress, and social support. Those were not, we didn't see changes there, at least not significant changes. So, you know, we didn't change everything we hoped to change, but we did see significant improvements on both site level outcomes that we looked at, which I think is very encouraging. These are both very important outcomes, you know, having a peer supportive organizational climate. That to me is kind of a, you know, perhaps a reflection that this going through this training and, you know, both for the individual and, you know, hopefully the entire site really did change. Obviously, these findings are based on just the perceptions of the peer workers themselves, but, you know, it seems like those organizations value peer workers more. So the training helped highlight, I think, a lot of the strengths of the peer workforce, and, you know, helped the organization see, you know, there really is a lot of unique and good work that can be done by peer workers that can't be done by non-peer workers. And so they have a unique role. It's a meaningful role and a useful one. The other one, the recovery orientation of the services, is also very important. So this, you know, having more equitable relations between service providers and recipients, that's really powerful. You know, if we think about like learned helplessness and empowerment, by having these more equitable relations, you can, you know, more effectively empower recipients of mental health services and, you know, help them take control of their lives and set goals and recover. So a lot of good can come from both of those site level outcomes. And we hope to be able to look and see how those site level outcomes relate to treatment outcomes in the future. Currently, we have not been able to do that. But, you know, at least conceptually, we would think we would expect to see a relationship between that and treatment outcomes. Okay, so that said, you know, it's still important to recognize that these are all intent to treat analyses, which means that we're not taking into consideration whether people went to the trainings or not. If you're in the control group, or if you're in the intervention group, irrespective of whether you went to the trainings or not, you are included in the analysis. And so the lack of engagement, I wouldn't say lack, I mean, there was good engagement, but it's just, there was also a lot of non-compliance with treatment non-compliance in the sense that not everyone went to all the trainings. But we do have null findings for all the peer outcomes and the supervisor ratings by the peer workers. So, you know, this is limited to the peer worker perspective. It may be that the supervisors, we will see more outcomes there. We have the data, we're cleaning it. We just finished data collection in January, so it's a pretty tight turnaround to even get as far as we have, given the amount of data cleaning that needs to occur. But we will get there. We'll check out the supervisor outcomes, and a more complete report will be coming in the near future. I did want to talk about some of the strengths of the study. So I think one of the core strengths is the high internal validity in the sense that we used a randomized trial. So, you know, it does allow for causal inferences. And so we can, you know, we have good evidence to suggest that these trainings are leading to some outcomes and not others. as previously described. I think also the fact that we did this on a low budget and, really worked with practice settings that are working in the real world in a big city, there's a lot of external validity too. A lot of the times with randomized trials, you'll get good outcomes, but it'll be because things were so tightly controlled and, very high levels of compliance because, there's incentives and, a lot done to make things work really well. And we didn't have any of those luxuries. I mean, we didn't have a lot of funding. And, it's just a big, messy trial, and we still got some findings. So I think it's very replicable. There's, these trainings can be used in other settings and would likely lead to the similar findings. Considering we had no incentives for either data collection or going to any of the trainings other than, people's desire to learn and get there's, I think, CMEs, I'm not sure I got the word right, but the continuing education credits were also available through those trainings. And we also use established measures, so that's always good. Some of the study challenges that we bumped into, as I already mentioned, it was really minimal funding for such a large cluster randomized trial. Typically you would have millions of dollars to do this kind of work, and we did it on a shoestring. Also, there's a new director at the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health at the outset, and although we had Dr. Sharon's endorsement and support, those transitions in leadership may have influenced our ability to recruit organizations. Something we didn't talk about as a team that much, but I got to think like the power dynamics between the peer-run organization training the supervisors who are, typically have substantial amount of, quote unquote professional training, that might have brought some challenges because here this peer-run organization is going to tell you how to do your job. And, irrespective of any of that, carving out days to go to trainings is really hard because, you have a lot of people you have to see, and you don't get paid to go to the trainings. You get paid to see clients. So you had to carve time out of your day to do this, and that's just a hard thing to do. Another thing that's kind of unique about what we did as opposed to a more traditional, well-funded cluster randomized trial is that the trainings were really developed without time to pilot test. I mean, they were still being developed as we were collecting the baseline data. So, I think the ideas were there because, the grant was written and Share had a good idea of what they wanted to do, but they still had to put together a lot of materials during the, during the project. And so there wasn't pilot testing, and the interventions weren't, I thought that they did a great job with the trainings and have great content, but they didn't have time to, pilot test and then change things. It was just, we're going to do the trainings and then, and that's it. So, I wanted to talk some about future directions too. I don't have the slide in, but I think there's a lot of directions to go in terms of looking at both the outcomes of the recipients of peer support. So, the whole point of this is to help the mental health consumers or recipients of the peer support help them more. And so we want to look at those outcomes and see if the changes in the organization led to meaningful changes in the outcomes of the users. And so there's a lot of work to do, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in the future. And the special thanks, so I did want to thank Denise Vasquez and Brandon Nussbaum for their contributions to data collection and analysis, Ruth Holman for her outstanding leadership in making this project possible, both Libby Hardigan and Jason Robinson for their logistical and implementation support, and Jessica Wolf, also an important member of the study team who helped a lot with study conceptualization and thinking through a lot of issues throughout many meetings. And also, of course, to thank the funding, which was provided by the California Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. So that is what I wanted to share with you guys today, and I'll just pause there and see if there are questions.
This is Brian. I'm just going to help out with the technical thing a little bit. If you would like to ask a question, you can unmute your phone. If you're calling in from a telephone, press *6 to mute or unmute yourself. And otherwise, if you can do the raise hand function, or just go ahead and unmute yourself and start asking a question. We'll try and do it one-on-one, but let's try it out. Thanks. Thanks, Louis.
Oh, I see a bunch of questions in the chat box. I'll just start going through them. Let's see. Okay, the audio did get better. Okay, the availability of training. Are they archived or available? And so I think a lot of the training material is being shared today. And yes, we have online trainings that are available. Those will soon be publicly available. So you will be able to get the training content. In terms of downloading the slides, I think all slides from all presentations will be available after the conference. Oh, yeah, that got answered. Okay, so what question from Krista Sacco? Oh, no, that's private. Well, what can we do to mitigate peer workers' experiences of discrimination, both in organizational culture and in changing our research to better capture the discrimination experience? So, you know, we did measure discrimination experience, and I think the Becoming an Ally training was really focused on addressing that issue in terms of, you know, I personally am a firm believer in those, just having dialogues about it within the organization. You know, you have to carve out time for that, but helping everyone understand each other's perspectives and how that discrimination plays a role in our in our world, and both in our lives and in the larger environment. By developing more of a consciousness around that, I just think people learn to, you know, so much of it is subconscious, and so by bringing it out into our consciousness, we can be much more aware of it and prevent it and speak out against it because we notice it, rather than it just being you know, background noise that we don't even realize is going on. Okay, another question. What made you interested in doing this great and needed research study? So I've been doing, I didn't talk about my background in the beginning, but I'm trained in community psychology. I've been working with consumer-run organizations and self-help support groups since being a graduate student. So I've done a fair amount of work in this area, and it's always been a big interest to me. You know, I was just kind of fortunate in that Ruth Holman reached out to me asking if I'd like to be involved in the evaluation, and I said yes. And so we were fortunate enough to be able to do this study. And you know, it's always been aligned with my interests, and I think there's just a ton that can be gained from effective peer support. So I'm not someone that thinks all models and methods work. I think there's a right way of doing this and there's a wrong way. And so the more we can figure out what the right way is and support doing things the right way in the mental health system, I think is, you know, really important, and there's lots to be gained from it. So what treatment outcomes are you thinking about exploring? I would think recovery would be one that comes to mind. I'm certainly interested in others' thoughts as to what treatment outcomes we should be focused on. Some of the ones, so we are hoping to get some data from the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. We have yet to get it and see how feasible analyses would be, but they've got, I think, things like homelessness and hospitalization and a couple other measures that everyone collects. So we would just have to see what's possible. I mean, obviously that's secondary data, so, you know, not what we would pick. They're not going to have a measure of recovery, I don't think, although you never know. But yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in mental health, service satisfaction, are a few that come to mind initially. And then, okay, another question, will there be further analyses with just the participants who completed the trainings, or at least 2 or 3? So we can do those additional analyses. It's not as, you lose your internal validity when you start doing that. So your ability to make causal inferences is not as great once you start looking at just those who engaged, because there's a bias. I mean, obviously some choose to engage and go to the trainings and some choose not to. But yes, we can do those analyses, and we will. There will be time. Oh, there's time. Yes. Yes. Will the data be published when completed? Will it be public? Yes. Yes and yes. I mean, obviously we have these slides now. You know, these are not final. So I would imagine what gets published in a peer-reviewed journal article will be a little bit different, but I'm, you know, confident we've done the analyses right at this point for those that we are sharing, and so I don't expect them to change much. And it will be publicly available. And there will also be a preliminary report coming from this project that'll come out before the publication in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay. Can you share a specific question from the survey related to the peer supportive organizational climate? I just need clarification. Yes. All right. So let me pull that up. It'll just take me a minute. Oh, it's slow. Well, I will say most everything is Likert scales, so it would be like strongly disagree to strongly agree type questions. I have the document open, but it's still lagging. Okay, now my computer's freezing. The joys of technology.
Dr. Brown, while we wait, do you mind if I ask another question?
Yes, go ahead.
This is Cameron. So I'm from Rochester, New York, and one of the things that we're seeing in the greater system is peer specialists are, thankfully, the positions are being mandated, or I don't know if thankfully, there's a lot more peer positions being opened. Some are mandated by regulatory state agencies, which seems great, but then what's happening in practice is sometimes peer supervisors are fully just from the clinical perspective and don't have any knowledge on the peer model. So I'm just wondering if that's something you run into, and what are some strategies to help have that be more of an effective peer supervision?
Well, I think they should go through this training. Yeah, I think that's a big problem, is like ambiguity around the peer worker role, and not everyone being on the same page as to what that entails. And both for the supervisors and peer workers, I mean, the extent to which there's training and familiarity with best practices varies widely. And there's, very limited research as well in terms of, what are the best practices and what works well and what doesn't. So, there needs to be a lot of work done in this area, a lot more work. And also, I think, to the best of my knowledge, the content, particularly in that in the first training, strategies for an effective peer workforce, really goes through a lot of the basics. And so anyone, peer workers and supervisors, should be familiar with those concepts.
That's great, thank you. And you mentioned that those trainings are going to be available publicly. What would be the best way to find those?
I'm going to defer to Libby. She was very involved in putting those online, because some people couldn't go to the in-person trainings that they did, and so they did put them online. And of course, initially we just left those available to the participants in the trial, but now we'll be releasing them to the public. So I think if you get in touch with Share, they'll be able to direct you to those trainings.
Great, thank you.
I did finally get the document open. So peer supportive organizational climate. It was a 7-point scale. A few of the questions are administrative leadership encourages appreciation of peers of this organization. So strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then the organization is a good place for peer specialists to work. I am satisfied with the way this employer values everyone, regardless of the person's status or experiences of mental health challenges. I am comfortable with how peers are treated by this employer. Administrative leadership talks about the value of peer involvement and leadership. So really, the administration and the organization being supportive of peer workers and peers in general. That's what that scale is about. Are there other questions?
This is Jenny Hill. I'm from Denver, Colorado. I'm a person in recovery. I'm actually the Recovery Services Program Administrator, and I'm in a really unique role. These trainings, could you see them as being beneficial from like a program improvement standpoint? I'm rolling out trainings and technical assistance to integrate the peer support workforce at the city. But I have a lot of people because of grant funding requirements that have hired peer supporters, and I couldn't agree more with your statement on ambiguity and consensus about the peer role. But I'm wondering if these trainings might be helpful after programs have already started.
Yeah, I think so, because, you know, we're not coming out of left field with these ideas that get shared in the training. So, you know, I would think organizations that are doing this work, you know, maybe they don't know as much, or providers don't know as much as they should, or not quite as clearly focused as they could be. You know, there's, you know, some level of efficacy, and with some further training, you can develop more. So yeah, absolutely. I see these being used as, you know, a strategy for program improvement, and something that has to be continually revisited, because, you know, we also always need to be reflective of our practice and how to, you know, how we can improve, and revisiting these core concepts always helps with that.
Thank you for that answer. And I have just a follow-up question. You know, I'm somebody who's been in this workforce for a long time, and prior to that worked 20 years in healthcare. And I'm working on a systems level, and I am seeing that power differential play out, where despite all of my experience, to include co-founding a nonprofit organization and being the program director at that organization, I'm definitely not taken as seriously as my colleagues. And there's that, well, who are you to tell me? Like, I have a PhD.
Right. Right.
You only have a college degree.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an ongoing challenge, and you know, I do think it's better than it was 30 or 40 years ago, at least, but, you know, still a long way to go. But yeah, you know, what we value, and whether we value professional credentialing versus lived experience and experiential knowledge, you know, and all the stigma amongst providers, you know, I didn't report on the peer supervisor data, but we do have the baseline data, and we do know that the providers have as much stigma as towards mental illness as the general population. So, you know, there's a lot of stigma out there, and you know, it does impede our work, and impede the valuing of peer support.
Thank you so much. That's helpful to me.
Yeah, totally. Are there other questions?
Hi, this is Martha Barbona. I have a sort of a question to you, but also to everyone. A lot of what I hear is people talk about how they can't keep peer specialists, like they burn out. You know, we train them, they work, and often it's described as, you know, they can't stay well or they burn out. And my question always back to them when I hear that from non-peer supporters is, you know, is it because they're being pulled to do things that aren't within our values and ethics? Because that was my experience. And I wonder if trainings like this, if they could sort of be packaged in a way, geez, you know, if this is what you're experiencing, this would be a way to look at that and see if there's an improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the problems with burnout and turnover are definitely very real. And, you know, I do think some of that is problems with the nature of the job and making sure it's a job that, you know, where the supervisor, you do have effective support and supervision for your job, and you're in a role where you're taking advantage of your strengths and using those to help others. But also, you know, a lot of the training was about self-care and, you know, recovery planning and going to self-help support groups like Recovery International. And so, you know, planning how you're going to manage if crises occur, and all the various self-care strategies that we all need to stay well. So, you know, I think both the self-care is really important in terms of reducing that turnover and burnout, but also having the appropriate supervision and being put in a role that is sustainable. So, you know, you got to look at the big picture, and there's a lot of things going on, and the trainings tried to address all of those issues.
This is Cameron. Just to respond to that last question, that's actually one reason why I was concerned about peers not putting the cart in front of the horse, so to say, and not having the right infrastructure and support for peer specialists. And then if they burn out or even worse, have a relapse due to their job reoccurrence, then the peer is blamed, when really the system might not have been as supportive as it could have been. As a peer supervisor myself, and also personally a peer, I would say on average 60 to 70% of my supervisory support is around self-care on different levels.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So, excellent point. Thank you for sharing. If there's others that want to share from their own experiences, feel free. I mean, it doesn't have to be a Q&A. We can switch to just a dialogue.
Hi, this is Laura from New York. I just wondered, did the study include peer-run organizations? And if so, are the site outcomes data going to be separated in some way to compare peer-run versus other organizations?
Yeah, great question. I should have clarified that at the beginning. So these are professionally operated service providers, all of them, to my knowledge. There were none of them were specifically peer-driven. I should double check. I don't know if there's anyone from SHARE on the call that can confirm that none of them were peer-run, but I know most of them were not peer-run.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Johnson. I'm from New York. I am the assistant manager of Onward Recovery in Newburgh, New York. I agree with a lot of what people's comments. I know in my experience as somebody who supervised peers for probably over 20 years, the issue of keeping peers well and keeping a workforce has been an issue. I know in my experience, there has been, with the peer workforce increasing, there has been, lack of knowing how to supervise properly, understanding self-care. Even in peer-run organizations, there sometimes is a lack of knowing how to supervise properly, understanding the importance of self-care with those peers, because if peers are not well, they're not really given a quality of service. I want to thank you for doing this research, and I'm hoping more research will develop so some type of evidence-based practice could be developed, that we start to really certify, you know, our supervisors and have continuing training, because I think the quality of service and sticking to our values is important, that we have good supervision as a peer. As a LMSW is also a problem in that field too, the lack of supervision. We've had many issues with social workers have committed suicide, have, you know, so the importance of supervision, especially in the helping profession. So thank you so much for doing this research. It has been helpful, and I'm hoping that we get to see more in the future.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. Yeah, and I do think the trauma-informed peer supervision model really helps with a lot of this as well. Thinking through, you know, how to be an effective supervisor and support peer workers. So yeah, there's lots to think about to do it well. Any other questions or comments?
Dr. Brown,
Oh, sorry.
sorry, somebody asked if,
Yeah, there's going to be another presentation at 10:45 in here. We also have another room if you want to continue conversations with various people, which I've posted in the chat. It's a meeting where anyone through the whole presentation can go into and just have discussions. But the next presentation that's going to start at 10:45 is Reducing Stigma in the Workplace, Becoming an Ally. And it's in this exact same room if you want to stick around for it. Otherwise, we'll be switching to that at 10:45. If you want to continue questions, you can go into the room ID that I am posting right now as well. Thank you.
Okay. And I did see a question about my email. So my email is, it's in the slides on the cover page, but it's Louis, Louis .d.brown @uth.tmc.edu. Let me put it in this chat box too. Maybe that makes it easier. I know it's hard to catch all those dots when I'm talking. I'd be happy to, talk with anyone further. Okay, well, with that, I'll wrap it up. And thanks, guys. Really appreciate the questions and enjoyed the conversation.